Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Wandering Road podcast. I'm your host, Chris, and for today's show, I'm joined by a co host, my buddy Aaron. And today, we're going to be talking about the revisionism of history. Is history being rewritten in a modern context to focus more on people's feelings over the reality of what happened in the past? Hey Aaron, how are you doing today, buddy?
Doing well, Chris. Happy to be back on. I'm not sure if I'm your first repeat guest or not, but excited to be here and talk history like you and I do every day.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad to have you back on the show. And it was crazy, man. This is something we've talked about before. Like, history being rewritten in the modern context, people putting their feelings on how they feel over certain historical figures or historical events or historical time periods, as opposed to focusing on the realities of what actually happened and what took place and what can we learn from these situations. Because I don't know about you, but I notice a lot of people looking at history, one with their feelings, and two with the mindset of a modern person, and not taking into context that all of these concepts and these ideas and these philosophies that we may have now, philosophies of our culture and society, that wasn't a thing back then. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with that for sure. One comment that really came into my head kind of as you were talking and as I think about revisionism or revisiting history and rewriting it, there was a quote by Oscar Wilde, and it said, "Our only duty to history is to rewrite it." And I think that is drastically taken out of context. And I think from that standpoint is for rewriting history, we shouldn't be doing it for the sake of rewriting it. We should be doing it to learn from it. And I think one important point that you actually just brought up there was people are looking at it from the present mind. They're not looking at how things were 500 years ago, how 1,000 years ago, or how they were 1,000 years ago. But right now, yes, a lot of these things might not be acceptable. What happened a long time ago, heck, even things are completely different from when you and I were growing up, 15, 20 years ago. But I think the whole idea is really just we need to be able to learn from our past failures and we need to be able to not repeat them. So I think from that standpoint, I think a lot of people are just taking it in the wrong context because we just have so much going on these days where people are saying this isn't right. You can't say this. This isn't how things should be done. But again, 15, 20 years ago, hundreds of years ago, it wasn't the same thing. It was a completely different time.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. And I want to harp on something that you just said. This is something like, we should learn from. And people doing this in the modern context, they're not paying attention to the fact that this was back then and this was the mindset. One thing that I do notice as well, aside from the modern, applying the modern thought to ancient figures or ancient empires, is how, especially in today's media, they will completely change an entire historical figure based off of the feelings of a person. For example, for Julius Caesar, I'm a huge fan of Julius Caesar. Yes, I know if you read his commentaries, if you read his commentaries on the Gallic War, his figures of how many Gauls were killed in combat and all the tribes wiped out, how many were sold into slavery, absolutely horrible. I understand that. But for me, if I was creating a documentary about Julius Caesar, I have an understanding that Julius Caesar was a particular type of person that had specific traits, and there were things that he did do, and there were things that he didn't do. One, if I would have someone portray Caesar, I'm not going to have them portray Caesar to look like me because one, Caesar was a Roman. Two, I'm not going to fabricate these characteristics about Caesar. If I'm going to do that, then we get into the realm of historical fiction, where that's completely fine. I don't know if you've ever watched the Bridgerton series on Netflix, but essentially it's about 19th century England, like the upper echelons of society in the early 1800s. And the casting is very ethnically diverse. And they made a spin-off of the Queen, who is played by or I think she might have been from the UK. I can't really remember. But for the context of that show, for being part of the Bridgerton series, which we already know is a work of fiction, and how that character was already portrayed, it made sense. But to completely, let's say, change the way a character, not just a character, but a historical figure looks, to pander to a base or to twist it for modern feelings, I think that's where we get into an issue. And I think you know where I'm going with this, with what's a
Yeah,
hot button topic right now.
and I think the important thing you said there was fiction. And again, I think you and I, we talk about this all the time because we are very analytical people. But even too, we kind of hit on it in our first podcast, just about historical aspects. But for me, I will tell you, as a historian, and just having a love of history, I have no problem if they do this from a fictional standpoint. But when it comes to nonfiction, historical accuracy, if we're doing a documentary, a biopic, if we're doing a series about a specific person in time, a specific colony, for example, whatever it may be, that needs to be, for me, 100% accurate, because at that point, again, you're rewriting history, but you're also rewriting somebody's history. I think the hot button topic right now is essentially Cleopatra,
Right.
because Netflix released this series and it has less than a 2% rating on Rotten Tomato. And it is just getting the air, the anger, everything you can imagine from the general population to even the Egyptian government themselves, which is very fascinating. But I think this is pretty much your present example of, this is a historical character. We pretty much, again, we didn't live in that time, but there's, I think, enough proof and evidence to understand that Cleopatra was a Greek. She's Hellenistic. When she first entered Rome, she was sculpted, and she was sculpted with red hair. And I will tell you, as an Irish person, I can understand this. Again, I don't have an Irish accent, but I'm almost 50% Irish. I understand my heritage and red hair, and I am not going to necessitate that to anybody other than potentially an Anglo-Saxon or an American or just a general Caucasian. So, from that standpoint, I think some of those topics is why they're just getting a lot of backlash, because essentially you're rewriting somebody's history from somebody's perspective who is not of that background.
Yeah, I completely agree. And to go back to the Cleopatra stuff, one thing to consider, and I studied classics while I was in school. I'm a huge classics junkie. I love the Roman Empire, Alexander's Empire, the Persian Empire, ancient Egypt, the Kingdom of Kush, the Mauryan Empire in India, from that classical time period all the way to China. I absolutely love that stuff. Like I dug my heels into that all that stuff. That really attracted like I was really attracted to that stuff when I was in my college years. And one thing I'll tell you about the Cleopatra stuff, the whole conversation basically saying that they don't know her actual ancestry or what she looked like. One thing to note, that xenophobia in the ancient world was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Greek xenophobia was a thing. Macedonian xenophobia was a thing. Alexander got shit for marrying what they would consider a barbarian woman in Roxana. Cleopatra is descended from the Ptolemies. Ptolemy, for those of you that are not familiar, was one of Alexander's most trusted generals. When Alexander died, Ptolemy went to Egypt and solidified his claim there. And one thing that the ancient Egyptians, especially the royal families, always practiced to keep their blood pure was incest. Brothers and sisters, even in, when I say ancient Egypt, I'm not just talking about Ptolemaic Egypt. I'm talking about from the time of Ramses and Tutankhamun. Like that was incest was a thing to keep the bloodline pure. So Cleopatra would have been a product of that as well. She would have been inbred. And on top of that, we, like you mentioned, like we have busts of her, we have coins of her, we have frescoes, we have all of these depictions of what she actually looked like. And I think the worst thing you could do is completely reshape a person that actually lived and reform them to what you think that they were. The other bone that I have to pick with this is their depiction of her. She wasn't like this warrior queen or anything like that. She was highly intelligent. She spoke multiple languages. She was actually one of the first of the Egyptian ruling class to actually speak Egyptian, speak the local language of the Egyptian people. This is just me throwing it out there. The only reason, to me, anyone that studies the classics in history, you could debate this up and down all you want. We could have a discussion about it if you want, if you don't agree with me. Yeah, if you have a counterpoint and you think differently, feel free to let me know. But I think the only reason that she was relevant is because her brother and his court was responsible for the murder of Pompey the Great. And if you don't know who Pompey was, basically it's really weird because Pompey was married to Julia, who was Caesar's daughter, and they ended up fighting each other in the Civil War because by the time that happened, Caesar crosses the Rubicon, Julia's dead, Julia's son is dead, she died on childbirth, so they don't have any real ties. Caesar still had adoration for Pompey because they were friends. So the Ptolemaic court, Cleopatra's brother, Cleopatra, I believe she wasn't around at the time because I believe she might have been exiled or something of the sort, which is why she had to be smuggled into the carpet, if you believe that story. He orders the beheading of Pompey. If you switch the roles, I have a feeling that Caesar would have had Cleopatra's head on a pike. And that would have been the end of Cleopatra.
And I don't disagree with that. And just for clarification, we're not talking about Ptolemy the mathematician. We're talking about Ptolemy the Macedonian general. Um, I don't know
Yeah.
why that just popped into my head here, but I would agree with you there. Essentially, I think, and heck, you just got me rolling there with the whole Pompey and going down with Caesar as well. I don't know why. I just got flashbacks watching Rome on HBO.
Such a good show.
Yeah, exactly, for crossing the Rubicon. But no, I think from that standpoint, I think I would agree with you on that point. And I think that just goes down another kind of hole of, okay, if the roles reversed, for example, what if, what would happen, what would go in that standpoint. But the one thing that I kind of was looking at here, kind of as you're looking at really the revisionism of all of this, was the fact that I just thought it was very interesting that the Egyptian government was literally coming out in the media and pretty much just pointing fingers and saying, who are you to rewrite our history? Who are you to be able to come and do this? And I don't have the creator's name, or actually here, Tina Garavi was the person who actually did Cleopatra along with Jada Pinkett Smith, but they pretty much just came straight out and said, hey, you're not Egyptian, you're Persian. Who are you to come in and actually rewrite our history? Which kind of going down a little bit of a rabbit hole. And I know this is something, you're very familiar with as well, but it's an existential problem of people just trying to rewrite Egyptian history because it seems like, and I believe this is one of the big talking points of the film, Cleopatra being a little more dark skinned, they are trying to tie her more into traditional African descent versus looking at her as an Egyptian as a whole.
Yeah, you are correct in that assessment, especially with the Egyptian government coming out against it. They actually filed a lawsuit against Netflix for that. It's interesting to note this isn't the first time that they have spoken out about the depiction of Cleopatra. You remember back in the 50s when they released that Cleopatra movie with Liz Taylor?
Elizabeth Taylor.
Yeah, that was banned in Egypt, right?
Yeah, it was.
Absolutely banned in Egypt because Elizabeth Taylor, I think she from the UK? I think she might have been.
I believe she might have been. If it, I think I know she's more seen as an American, but she might have had an upbringing in the UK.
Yeah, it says that she was British American, so she was from the UK as well, and essentially she was an Anglo-Saxon. She looks nothing like a Greek Macedonian type of looking person,
Right.
and I think that's what they're getting at. What is hard for me to understand, why is it that people pick and choose these different histories to essentially claim? You know what I mean? In a sense that, did they go after Egypt because they think Egypt is a small country that they're not gonna, they don't know any better? Like what I want to understand is the line of thinking that thinks that this is okay. So I'm half Indian. If Netflix decided to do the Ramayana and they casted Tom Cruise as Ram, yeah, I would have a fucking problem with that.
Right.
And I think it's the same thing for the Egyptians. I don't think it's something based off of, if you have everyone saying that, hey, like this isn't right, it's not because the entire world is racist. And I think that's the one thing that the people like the producer and Jada Pinkett Smith, who I don't like, I think Will Smith should leave her. She's a terrible person. That man has suffered enough. He deserves to be free. Um, but
Hey, Will Smith.
free Will Smith, right? Yeah, let me not mention her name too much because I don't want to get smacked. But the number one drawback that they have is that, oh, you're a racist. Like, I'm providing you with actual evidence. Here's a fresco. Here's a coin minted in Alexandria. Here's a sculpture made in Alexandria. I don't know, what more do you want? And I think it comes from like, okay, because Egypt is continentally a part of Africa, I would understand, okay, yes, it's part of African history, which I will give you that. The same way I look at India and southern India, a kingdom in central, the Maratha Empire. My ancestry comes from northern India. The Maratha Empire was in the central part of India. I'm still proud of it because it's Indian history. So there's nothing wrong with being proud of the history of the overall geographical area where you come from. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand that. And I think you actually just brought up something interesting that I really thought about kind of as we were talking about doing this podcast is a lot of this revisionist history is selective. So it's why are you focusing on Cleopatra, for example? I don't know why, but this just popped into my head. But you don't see, and I again, I know you know the backstory of this, but I don't see people trying to do a revisionist history of Genghis Khan, for example. Why is that? Is it because of where he came from? Is it because of who he is? Is it because people just don't think he's an important person in history in itself? Which, I mean, if you look at the Mongol Empire and how vast it was, I mean, it is just, it's outstanding that he was able to conquer as much as he did. But you don't really hear a lot about, hey, he used to massacre children, he used to massacre women by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands. He was a very horrible person. But why aren't you going and doing this after somebody like a Genghis Khan, for example? And I'm not using that in the sense of, Cleopatra and Genghis Khan are two separate people, but I just think it's really fascinating how selective it is whenever it comes to some of the revisionists of history. And you and I talk about the Civil War a lot too, but I know from my standpoint, kind of looking at, like how the Egyptian government feels about, because it's a reflection on their people. But if I look at historical points in United States history, kind of tying back to, from us being from the US, if I'm watching a documentary about John Adams, I don't really want to see somebody who isn't essentially an Anglo-Saxon or a Puritan white man from the 1760s, 1770s. I don't want to see somebody from the Civil War who is fully clean shaven and is just well done up person, because look at all the pictures, the photographs. I mean, these guys, I'll just say it, a lot of the guys in the Civil War just look like absolute bums. But I want to see somebody with a rugged beard. I want to see somebody who looks like they are from, the central part of the United States, for example, or even two from the South in general. I want to see that homely person. I don't want to see a differentiation. And I know I kind of went off on two separate points there, but I just I think that's a really good point as well. Is and I don't know if we'll get this understanding, but why is there so much selectivism in regards to the characters and the history that is being rewritten? Because it seems like some of the same history is just rewritten over and over again. And you might be able to talk on this, so I'll pose it to you real quick. But we were talking about the 1950s. Go back to the Ten Commandments. Look at Charlton Heston in that movie. Yes, he is very tan in that movie and looks a little bit darker, but who's to say if, Moses from that time actually looked like that? But also, too, they did certain depictions of the Egyptian generals, like Ramses, for example. For me, looking at a picture of Ramses, it didn't seem like that far off. And it seemed, for me, I would look at that as being kind of historically accurate.
Right. I see with the Ramses with Yul Brenner, he has this kind of Eastern look to him, Asiatic look to him. Like he's able to pull it off. But yeah, you're right about Charlton Heston. Moses would have been look like someone from modern day the Levant area.
Hmm.
Like he would be Semitic looking. For me, with the Genghis Khan thing, that I find it fascinating that you bring that up because I actually had a point about Genghis Khan. Put it this way, Hollywood made a movie and they had John Wayne play Genghis Khan.
I do remember this.
It's so random to me. Like, even back then, they were doing it. And we recognized very quickly, like, hey, this isn't right. I don't understand what point did we get to in our modern world, in our present day world, that it's okay to start doing that again. For me, just tell me the history as it was. Portray the people as they were. If I'm watching a show about Vikings, I want to see Norsemen. I don't want to see people that look like me
Right.
because I know damn well for a fucking fact there was no one there that looked like me. Like you don't need to that this is I harp on this all the time. I don't understand the infatuation with having to see people that look like you in order to enjoy content. Like, dude, I fucking enjoy Bruce Lee movies. I'm not Chinese. Like, I don't understand where we went with the fascination of, oh, I can't like if there's not a character that looks like me. You know what I mean? I think that really dumbs down the art and the creativity. If you're focusing more on representation of like, okay, we got to make sure everybody is part of this movie, but the movie takes place in fucking 280 China or Japan, like it's not going to make any fucking sense. If anything, people are going to start questioning it.
Yeah,
Like,
and for context, real quick too. So you mentioned the movie with John Wayne. It's called The Conqueror. It's from 1956, and I know it wasn't around back then, but it only got an 11% on Rotten Tomatoes.
as it really should. And to go back to the Ten Commandments, to my knowledge, there were no Egyptians casted in that movie.
No.
And Hollywood had this thing where they would, if you were portraying like a dark person, they would paint you like darker shade of brown or have you heavily tan or something like that. It was so messed up. I mean, to do that in the modern context, I mean, if it's fiction, fine, I'll live with it. For example, they just did the swap with the Little Mermaid.
Hmm.
I can live with that. But when you're swapping historical figures that we know what they look like, I think that's where we need to draw the line.
And I
And
think that's where a one point is that a lot of people are getting upset in one area versus others. Because I think you just made a really good point there. The sense that, hey, The Little Mermaid is fictional, it's a cartoon. I don't mind seeing a change in The Little Mermaid. I don't mind seeing a change in demographic in some of these cartoonish movies that Disney are redoing. Because again, it's all made up. These are all stories that were written. But when it comes to real time, real history, that's where you really get under people's skin because, again, you're essentially just trying to change it and make it your own because you either want to see, hey, yes, this happened, but let's put a little bow on this and let's try to spice it up a little bit so that way it's not as bad. Or, hey, we just want to remake this in our own fashion because we need to be able to change it up for modern day.
right, exactly. One more point I wanted to bring up was you remember that Hamilton musical that like
Yes.
everyone was crazy about? That apparently I never watched it. My sister watched it. She said it was really good, and I take her word for it. There was diverse casting there. Now, what I want to ask people is if with some type of machine, we go back in time and we get all the founding fathers that are portrayed in that play and we bring them to watch that in the theater and they see this diverse cast, people playing them that look nothing like them, what do you think their reaction would be?
Would not be good.
If the reaction is similar to how people are reacting now,
Hmm.
I think you could kind of gauge like whether you should do that or not. And the thing with the Cleopatra stuff, it's to me, it's just about history. If tomorrow they cracked open, they found Cleopatra in Mark Antony's tomb, and for some reason they were right, like people were right about her being non-Greek, there we go. Let's rewrite the history books correctly.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that would prove a lot of points because I think regardless, you're able to pull some kind of DNA sample, and let's say that did happen. I mean, I think that'd just be outstanding. But I think regardless, yes, you can get your answer, but what if it's the answer people don't expect? So, like I said, the director, she pretty much made a comment and said it's more likely that Cleopatra looked like our actor than she did Elizabeth Taylor. And who's to say that? What if it comes out and Cleopatra actually had Italian heritage? Or what if Cleopatra ended up being from the sandy areas of Spain? Whatever that may be, she more than likely still going to be a light skinned person. It just changes the background and what a lot of the historical context is. But unless there's some groundbreaking evidence that really comes out to say otherwise, I mean, again, at this point, you're just changing history for your own sake. And we were talking about, and I know we like to talk about this a lot, especially when it comes to, one, me being Italian, and also two, we like to talk about, Rome and the Roman Empire. But kind of another point that we were talking about with revisionist history as well, and I wanted to get your take on this, was the fact that a lot of people, and you can really go down a Reddit hole on this one, but the fact that people were just saying, oh, well, the Roman Empire is a fascist state. I wanted to kind of get your context on that a little bit and see what your thoughts are there.
Dude, you've seen me with the SBQR shirt.
Yeah.
So so the whole again, that's what irritates the hell out of me. Putting these modern ideas and concepts on empires of the past. Did the Romans do atrocious things? Yes. Did the Romans enslave millions of people? Yes. Did they wage a ton of wars? Yes. I will concede those points. Like every other major power in the world, it's not just exclusive to Rome. But what you have to understand about powers in antiquity, it was literally you conquered or you were conquered. There was no in between. And Rome, the creation of Rome as a city where it's situated on the Italian peninsula, they had the Samnites to the south and southeast. You had the Etruscans to the north that controlled them for a very long time. So the history and foundation of Rome was about survival. They were literally on their toes all the time. So with the Roman Empire, that was a natural cause and effect of their experience as a people. It wasn't more so that, okay, we just want to be left alone. They weren't left alone. They were sacked by the Gauls. They were controlled by the Etruscans. They've had multiple wars with the Samnites. They fought the Carthaginians multiple times. So the Cimbri and the Teutones coming down, that happened later on during the time of Sulla and Caius Marius. But the point still stands. In antiquity, it wasn't like it is now, where if another country attacks another country, it's demonized, and there wasn't a UN back then to say, hey, Rome, you can't do that. You can't invade Gaul. You can't start enslaving these people. So for me, it was a matter of survival. It was a matter of once it grew to a certain point, like with every other empire, you have your very wealthy people and you have your ruling class taking power and becoming more influential. And then naturally that expands to satisfy the hunger of the greed of the ruling class, if that makes sense. So I don't like the concept of Rome was a fascist state. Can people take the symbols of Rome and use them for fascism? Yeah, they probably have, because one of my banner pictures on Facebook, this happened about, I don't know, like 6 years ago. It was the Roman eagle with a SBQR on it,
Hmm.
and it was taken down by Facebook for violating their terms of service for hate speech. And I reported back and I appealed it and I said, how is this hate speech? This is the symbol of the Roman Empire. You could literally go to Rome and you'll see SBQR marked on one of the ruins for like a forum or a temple or something like that with a dedication. What are your thoughts on the whole fascism and people labeling it in that way? I think I gave everybody like the historical background. I don't know if I really answered your question because I kind of went on a tangent because like I'm really passionate about the Roman Empire. But as far as like its architectural marvels and its engineering and its road system, its plumbing, everything that came along with it that we saw went away after when the Middle Ages started and the Dark Ages. It shows how important Rome was.
I love hearing you rant about things. So it was good for me from a historical standpoint. I mean, honestly, it's you kind of said it in the beginning. It's taking modern views and placing them on historical aspects. And for anybody who really knows the history of it, fascism was essentially created in 1919 by Benito Mussolini. So this has been around barely 100 years. And just the problem I have with it is kind of like what you said. You are taking modern views about a person in particular, a government, a set of people, for example, and you are importing it and you're trying to rewrite history to be able to say this is what it was. But again, you can't look at the Roman Empire and you can't tie that in with 1919 Italy. You can't tie that in with Nazi Germany, for example, because it's just completely different times. It's completely different eras. And yes, I think there was there's like 13 or 14 points that kind of define what fascism is. And I believe the Roman Empire hit 8 or 9 of it. So if you're looking at a 13 or 14 point system, yes, you're looking at over 50%. But again, some of those points that they talk about, I saw points where people were trying to say Rome was an imperial government. Rome was just a drastic monarchy in the sense that Rome was a republic for a lot longer than it ever was, if you even want to say imperialistic or any other term, for it being run by a solo ruler. So from that standpoint, to be able to use it from a political standpoint, you really can't use it because it was more of a republic and open mind and free thinking than anything. You have a lot of democratic processes that came out of ancient Rome. So I don't like that people are trying to contextualize history in that sense and say, oh, well, this is definitely meets that criteria. Guess what? Yes, it does meet that criteria. But like you said, Rome and Italy in itself was doing what it needed to do to survive. It was not doing this to try and rule the world.
Interesting enough, while you were talking, I actually pulled up the 14 points of fascism
Yeah.
to look into it. Powerful and continuing nationalism. Many countries do that. Disdain for the recognition of human rights. A lot of countries are guilty of that today. Identification of enemies and scapegoating. A lot of countries do that. Supremacy of the military. Many countries do that. Rampant sexism. That's still a problem today. Controlled mass media. A problem. Obsession with national security. A problem today. Religion and government intertwined. Corporate power is protected. Labor power is suppressed. Disdain for intellectuals and the arts. Obsession with crime and punishment. Rampant cronyism and corruption. Fraudulent elections. Dude,
So
you could
literally,
do
you're talking about the United States as a whole today.
not just that, like literally every fucking country on the planet could easily hit 9 or 10 of these.
So, and that just again, it serves the point. Why are you trying to rewrite history whenever we should be rewriting whatever's going on today? We should be
Right.
essentially learning, hey, this is what happened in the past. This is how we're going to fix it. This is how we're going to move forward. But I just, As you're reading those points, I'm literally just thinking present. The dude, this is the United States as a whole right now. So let's start that argument right there. Let's go on Reddit. Let's go online and say, hey, is the United States a fascist country?
Right. You could, if you want to make the bold claim to do that, you can. You literally can. And that's what's great about our country and freedom of speech and the Constitution, that we could have conversations like this without the fear of being suppressed.
Yeah,
Which,
and it's interesting too because you were kind of talking about points, and especially we'll kind of stick with Italy a little bit because that's where a lot of this comes from regarding the Pope. And if you look at Catholicism, for example, so I've gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole in the past and did some deep dives because I grew up Catholic. I am Byzantine Catholic, so I am more kind of Eastern Orthodox, Constantinople, Constantine the Great. That's kind of where my background in religion comes from versus the Western Roman Empire when the Pope is residing in Italy. Pope resided in France for it was at least 50 to 100 years at a certain point. But I mean, literally, if you want to talk about some of those points you were looking at it right there, a lot of people try to bury or overlook that the Catholic Church could be seen as a fascist movement because of mass media exposure. I'm trying to think of the point right now of certain essentially atrocities that went on during Catholic time in the Middle Ages. Oh, I think you know what I'm talking about here. But what was the name of the book, The Witch's Hammer, when the Catholic Church was trying to kill off witches and suppress any
oh,
people with free thinking?
the Malleus Maleficarum.
Yeah, Malleus Maleficarum. So you would literally see the Pope raise armies, and I mean, all you have to do is essentially just look at the Middle Ages and the Christians or Catholics, however you want to define them, going in to take back the Holy Land. So, I mean, but again, I think it's very selective because from a religious standpoint, a lot of people don't want to talk about that. And one of the things that I always say is I feel like the Catholic Church always tries to revise their history because as a more of a, I guess you could say, old world Catholic growing up, you're taught about the Old Testament. You're taught about demons. You're taught about, hey, don't do this because the devil is going to tempt you. And these demons might come after you, or these spirits might. There was a lot of talk about demonic entities. Really didn't talk a lot about possession, but I do remember growing up, you would hear stories about exorcisms and things like that. But the more modern Western Catholic Church tries to suppress all that because they don't want people to remember a lot of the atrocities that happened in the Old Testament before the time of Jesus. They want people to remember the good things about it because that is where religion is really set in. Versus, again, if you look at it from a historical standpoint, God did certain acts throughout tenures, like Jonah being disobedient, so he was eaten by a whale, for example. Moses and his people not being able to go into the Holy Land across the River Jordan for 40 years because Moses disobeyed. Things like that, these are all done for a purpose, but again, that's really not taught. They leave out the points about Joshua sacking Jericho, all these different entities that people would mesh with and all the killing that went on back then. But again, you don't talk about those things because it's not in good nature to be able to learn about it. But again, you have to learn from your history to be able to change it. And I think if people better understand that, then that is something that we can all learn from. But as we were kind of going through this, I don't know how, but it's interesting how religion can just all tie into this as well in terms of certain revisionism when you look at certain histories.
Oh, absolutely. And to go back to the Pope stuff you were talking about, Pope Julius II actually wore battle armor.
Yeah.
If you popes led armies into battle. Now, the Pontifex Maximus, which they kept the same title, the Pontifex Maximus in ancient Rome, was essentially the chief priest. The Pontifex Maximus wasn't allowed to wage war or declare enemies of the state or anything like that. Roman warfare was completely different. If you're talking about Republican warfare, like you literally had to have authorization from the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Like you couldn't just, and that was the problem. I don't mean to go back to Julius Caesar, but that kind of was the problem with Julius Caesar when he became the governor of like Transalpine Gaul and the places in northern Italy and on the outskirts of the empire, he started conquering. And that's how they got him on the technicality. Well, you're waging an illegal war. So it's kind of hard to say for the Romans in general that they used their religion to declare war, because what most people don't know is that with the Roman Empire, they tend, especially the military, the soldiers, they tend to incorporate the local beliefs and gods into their beliefs as they would go to these different places.
Yeah, and you see the same thing, especially too, even with, like you said, the Greeks, the Macedonians, the Spartans. A lot of them look to oracles or look to the gods before
Right.
they could even go into war season or declare war. And the one thing that always pops into my head is, and I know you love this movie too, but 300, whenever Leonidas goes to the oracles, and essentially they were, I don't know, you consider them fake oracles, but they were really paid off to be able to tell Leonidas that, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was not allowed to go to war, correct? And that's when he disobeyed, and that's when he walked up to the gates.
So so in the Frank Miller's novel, that's kind of how it was portrayed. But in reality, the situation was that when the Battle of Thermopylae, they were coming up to that battle happening, when the Athenians went for help and all the Greeks came together. It was essentially the Spartans were a very deeply religious people,
Hmm.
and at that time they were coming up on a festival, and the name of the festival escapes me.
That's
So
what it
they
was.
couldn't, yeah, they couldn't deploy for, I think it was at least 2 weeks, or
Yes.
until I think it was like the full moon passed or there was a new moon. And the Oracle of Delphi said to the Spartans that you either have to mourn the loss of a king or essentially see your city of Sparta in ruins and your people
Hmm.
enslaved. Now I'm just paraphrasing it. If you want to look up like the oracles from the Oracle of Delphi, you could find them online, like a whole list of them. It's pretty interesting that the last oracle that they gave, but I won't go off on a tangent with that one. But for the sake of the Spartan story, that's why he was only allowed to leave with his bodyguard. What was supposed to happen was the rest of the Spartan army after the festival was supposed to meet them there. And
Hmm.
then they were betrayed by Ephialtes that led the Persians around the pass. And then we know what happened there. But yeah, it was very much for certain groups of people, it was very much like religion and omens from the gods very much dictated when you fought and the time of day and stuff like that. Ariovistus, when he went to face off against Julius Caesar, he avoided fighting Caesar in a pitched battle multiple times because of their daily sacrifices, the augurs, um, and the entrails of like whatever birds or whatever they were sacrificing. Basically, their priest read it as a bad omen. Like, if you go into a pitched battle, you're going to lose.
Right.
And on one of those days, he was forced into a pitched battle with Caesar and he lost. We could get into the whole validity of that ancient religions as opposed to religions now, but that's a whole other conversation.
So we've kind of talked a little bit about ancient history. We've gone back into biblical times. We've talked a little bit about Cleopatra as well. So curious a little bit too, kind of bringing it not modern day, but looking at American history. This is something you and I look at a lot. Primarily from the Civil War, but also too, looking at other areas like the Revolution, for example. Do you see or do you have any thoughts about revisionism in American history? Are there any trends you're seeing or have been seeing? And I know one that always comes up to mind, and it's really just the topic of the removing of statues and even just talk about why the Civil War started in general. But what are your thoughts there? Like, are you seeing any trends or topics that might have been during the Civil War where people are trying to rewrite or throw their own narratives?
Absolutely, yes. And the thing about the statues, they were put up. I understand they were tributes to the generals, right? But they were put up in direct opposition of like the civil rights movements that were happening
Hmm.
at the time. So I think that was their way of being like, okay, well, if you're going to do this, if you're going to march through Richmond or whatever, right, we're going to put a big ass statue of Robert E. Lee the person that fought to keep you in bondage. I won't get too much into the statues, but the
I,
whole
I would say on that point real quick. I mean, I'm always on the side of, see, I separate for Virginia from the rest of the Confederacy because the way I see it and a lot of the readings that I do and kind of looking at it, I see as Robert E. Lee and the Army of Virginia were fighting for Virginia. They're fighting for their homeland. And yes, there's a lot to go into it with slavery, but essentially they wanted to fight for their own rights versus I feel the rest of the South was just kind of as a whole and they were fighting to say, okay, we don't want to get rid of slavery. This is going to be our own thing. But I look at somebody like a Stonewall Jackson, for example, or I look at a Robert E. Lee, and they are just proud Virginians who wanted to go and serve for their states instead of the federal government.
to piggyback off of what you just said, I viewed that entire conflict from like my personal perspective. And hear me out here. This might be a little far fetched. I don't know if you've done this before, or if anyone else listening to this has done this. Let's say, God forbid, there was another civil war, right? And New York, for some reason, broke away from the Union, and they're calling for volunteers to defend New York State. Let's say, for whatever reason, whoever's president at the time mobilizes a National Guard to actually go in and militarily suppress New York. I'm going to go fight for my home. I'm going to be really fucking honest with you because that's where I grew up. I have a lot of family there. That city and state raised me, even though I live in Pennsylvania now. That will forever be my first home. You know what I mean? So, from that context, I can understand why someone, even though like you don't give a crap about the political situation or anything like that, you're going to go defend your own. What you're going to do is, hey, that's my family. I'm going to stand up for him. I'm going to go help him. And I think that's the kind of thinking that the people enlisting might have had. I may completely be wrong about that, which, I'll hold my hand up and say, okay, we've been talking about not putting your modern thought into it, with history, and here you are doing the same thing, but trying to understand, like, okay, why would someone sign up to fight?
No, I understand it. And I look at it from the American Revolution standpoint. You could say the same exact thing for the start of the American Revolution, and all you have to do is look at Massachusetts. Massachusetts was under attack. They had the attacks at Lexington and Concord, and they were able to fend off. And then in 1775, the First Continental Congress gets called, and essentially what happens? The Continental Congress, mostly everybody outside of New England was against fighting the British. They were against, and I know the word independence wasn't really fully thrown around in 1775, but it started to come around at that point. But it was essentially Boston, the Massachusetts delegates, and New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island. They were all saying, hey, New England's under attack. We got to protect Boston. And then you have Pennsylvania, you got New Jersey, Virginia, everybody is completely against it. So, from that standpoint, they are protecting their own. That's what they want to do. If you look at it from the other aspect, again, those other states, they have no skin in the game at that point. We don't want King George coming after us. So, why are we going to risk the wrath of the British Empire when this is just really an isolated incident? So I understand that point 100%. I agree with you as well. Like you said, if somebody's attacking my family member, I don't need any context behind it. I'm going to go to battle with them. That's what I'm going to protect. That's my family. If Pennsylvania's under siege, I've lived in Pennsylvania my whole life. I'm going to go to bat for Pennsylvania. So it's one of those things where, from that standpoint, I think you see the same thing in the Civil War that a lot of the Virginians said, we're out to protect Virginia. We're not out to protect really the Confederacy as a whole, because if they're going to invade, we're the closest thing to them. Washington, D.C. is right here. It's barely, it's 100 miles from Richmond, if that, might be a little more. It doesn't take long to get there. But Virginia is the first casualty of the war as the federal troops start moving south. So they say, hey, we got to join in. We got to protect our own. Because if Jackson, if Lee, they go the other direction and they say, hey, we're going to join our compatriots who we fought with in the Mexican American War, and we're going to try to save the Union. What does that mean? They got to ransack their own state. So there's your decision right there. It's either I join and I destroy my homeland or my home state, or I stay in Virginia, I fight with the South, and I try to protect what is my essentially my land and my home area.
Right. Yeah. I completely get that. And real quick before I move on to the next point I wanted to get to about the Civil War stuff, New York for the first 3 months of 1861 flirted with the idea of seceding from the Union.
That's insane.
Now imagine a what if history moment. I think New York at the time was one of the most populous states along with Pennsylvania at the time.
Mhm.
Imagine if New York had seceded from the Union.
That would
That
have
would
been
be
nuts.
that would have been absolutely crazy.
I would just say real quick, I would also like to see the numbers, and I know the number was high, but I would have liked to see what it made difference number wise for the Confederacy versus the Union troops.
Yeah, that would have been interesting to see. What I wanted to bring up with the whole tying back to the whole like revisionism aspect, especially with the American Civil War today, I've seen an interesting statement. I forgot who said it, that essentially the statement goes was that the North may have won the war, but the South won the narrative. And what I mean by that is the South, the Confederacy, former Confederate States, they very much ran the campaign of states' rights. You and I like to visit these museums. And where did we go this last time? It was that extra exhibit at Gettysburg, right?
So it was the Civil War Museum at the Gettysburg Visitor Center, and they just completely remodeled and redid and added another wing. But as soon as you walk in, it's literally plastered with articles and posters about the wars about slavery, plain and simple.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like we saw the this huge sign from Senator Albert Gallatin Brown from Mississippi in the
Mhm.
1850s. And I quote, I want Cuba, I want Tamaulipas, and one or two other Mexican states, and I want them all for the same reason, the planting and spreading of slavery.
Hmm.
And this is coming from a senator in Mississippi in the 1850s. So one can safely assume that that was the rhetoric in general. And when Texas was the talk about annexing Texas, there was a huge hoopla over it because why was Texas going to come in as a free state, or was it going to come in as a slave state? Was
Hmm.
California going to come in as a free state? Is it coming in as a slave state? If the Civil War wasn't about slavery, why the hell does that discussion happen? Why does that even matter?
Right.
Whether they're coming in as a free state or a slave state.
Well, and the funny thing about that is too, is even if you look at a lot of historical content dating back to the Declaration of Independence, you'll see a lot of things about the verbiage that Jefferson wrote about slavery and the Declaration of Independence, and that being a very contingent point because even though again Jefferson was from Virginia, Jefferson had slaves. We know Jefferson's history with African Americans and especially too Sally Heming. They really understood that, hey, I know we're looking for independence, we're looking all men are created equal. However, you're going to get a lot of kickback from our southern brethren here from South Carolina and from Georgia and from even North Carolina as well, that they're not going to agree with a lot of these points. So you can even go back 100 years, whatever it is, back to the Revolutionary War. And you could even bring up that point that even before the Declaration was signed, there was a big contingency point just about even the verbiage alone about all men being created equal and not having slavery as a part of the new form union. So, I mean, there's so many points that point to it. It's just that there's a lot of Southern rhetoric that they want to try and rewrite and make them not look like they're the bad guys. So, like you said, the biggest one is they said, "Oh, we're fighting for state rights." Another one, and I don't know why, I just thought this was just absolutely ridiculous. but there was an argument just saying, oh, well, if we don't secede, the union is going to take over our cotton fields and we're not going to get the profits that we're getting and blah, blah, blah. And they were pretty much trying to make it an industrial thing, saying that, oh, that we're losing our industrial rights because if you take away our slaves, then we're not going to be able to produce like we used to. So there's so many tie arounds, and there's a bunch of scholarly articles that I've been able to read as well. There was one, I can't remember what her name is, but she's from Georgia State University, pretty much stating that the South rewrites its own history and has been able to rewrite its own textbooks because they don't want to teach the true meaning of what the Civil War is about. And plain and simple, the point was slavery.
Right, exactly. And this reminds me of the rewriting of history with World War II, with what the Japanese did at Nanjing, the rape of Nanking. That book.
Hmm.
Have you ever read that book?
I have not read it, but no, I'm very familiar with the topic.
The Japanese recently tried to scrub all their history textbooks of all the atrocities committed by the Japanese regime
Right.
on the Chinese, and all of these experimentations that they would do. And even now, even with Holocaust deniers, it still baffles me that even now, like, we have video evidence, we have photographic evidence of all this stuff that happened. And this one is gonna piss off Turkey. The Armenian genocide.
Hmm.
It happened. Stop acting like it didn't happen. Like, all of these things happened. And what we need to do is understand that this was a black eye on the history of humanity as a whole, not just human beings as a whole, that human beings were capable of enslaving one another, massacring each other just because you speak a different language or you look a little different. We have to learn from it. And that's the problem. We're not learning from it. What we're seeing is people gravitating this to the old school mentality, this tribalistic mentality of digging in their heels because they're afraid of being wrong.
It's people being selfish, and like you said, I think it just goes back to the whole kind of way we started off this podcast was history's not there to be rewritten for the sake of being rewritten. It's there to be able to learn from. It's we need to rewrite our history in the sense that let's not follow in the same footsteps of our ancestors. Let's not follow in the same footsteps of those who came before us. Let's take from them. Let's learn what happened, and let's be able to change it for the better. And I think that's just what people really get lost on is I think it's really people just trying to take the easy way out is kind of the way that I really see it, in the sense that, hey, this happened. Let's try to change the entire narrative and let's try to rewrite it to just look completely different. Instead of saying, hey, let's document this, let's talk about it, and then let's see where we can make the change going forward. And I think that's where more people need to really take some of these areas that we're talking about or looking at history as a whole is let's just become better human beings based off of what we've experienced and let's move on and just do better.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. You can find us on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most podcast platforms. Be sure to subscribe and share. Also, don't forget to give a follow on Instagram at twroadpodcast and follow my TikTok at twrpodcast. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.